Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's OpenAI Academy event. My name is Kirk Kalesian. I'm part of the education team here at OpenAI. Our team is hyper-focused on how AI can help staff and administration in K-12 districts do more of what they love and less of the peripheral work, freeing up time for more connection, deeper conversations, and more active learning for their students. I'm super excited to welcome you all to a special edition of the OpenAI Academy event series. Today's session is presented by our community partner, Common Sense Media. Common Sense Media is a nonprofit dedicated to improving the lives of kids and families by providing the trustworthy information, education, and independent voice that they need to thrive. They conduct research, ratings, education, and advocacy efforts in service of this mission. We're so thrilled to have them joining us today to walk us through strategies for developing a clear, adaptable AI policy in K-12 education. Artificial intelligence is already influencing how school systems make decisions, allocate resources, and operate day to day, but most education policies haven't caught up. So we've heard loud and clear that K-12 leaders need clear, responsible guidance to navigate this evolving landscape, and that's what we're focusing on today. A quick plug before we start for the OpenAI Academy. We're continually adding instructional videos and events geared towards the K-12 educator community on the OpenAI Academy website. So make sure to check back in to stay updated on the latest. And with that, I'll hand it over to the Common Sense Media team to get us started. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Kirk, and thanks so much for inviting us to be here today, and for our audience for attending this webinar. We hope it's going to be useful and actionable and help you get started with some important thinking as teachers are off for the most part for summer right now, and you all are thinking about the work of the upcoming school year 25-26. My name is Robbie Torney. I'm the Senior Director of AI Programs at Common Sense Media, and I'll introduce my fellow panelists in a moment. As Kirk just shared, we do have a variety of other AI initiatives and other work that we support. You can find all of that at commonsense.org/AI. Today, we're going to be really focused on K-12 policies related to AI, but we have resources related to research that we've conducted on AI. We have lessons for students. We have free professional development for educators. We have digital literacy lessons. So if you're not familiar with Common Sense Media or you're looking for some new resources, please check us out. I'm going to go ahead and have my other panelists come on stage and introduce themselves. Yvette, I'll kick it over to you first.
Hello, everyone. Yvette Renteria, Chief Program Officer here at Common Sense Media, and I support our research and our education efforts. Great to be with you.
Morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Minnie, the founder and partner of the law firm Young, Minnie & Core. I'm a 32-year veteran of the specialization of education law for public and private schools throughout the state of California.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Yvette, and thanks for being here today. Just as we're getting started, a disclaimer, we are going to be talking about K-12 policies, but this training can't, of course, substitute for personalized legal advice. So while our advice is based upon the latest available guidance, that is subject to change in this ever-evolving landscape. So with that caveat today, there's really three big things that we're going to be helping you think through today. The first is understanding why action can't wait, given the context of AI use in schools right now. We want to give you some real clarity around your policy options, including things like choice points, considerations that you should have in mind, and red flags as you're thinking about approaching AI policies in K-12. And we want to give you access to some practical tools you can use right now. How can you get started with the information that we're sharing today? We'll be directing you to a resource that we published recently called the Common Sense Media AI Toolkit for School Districts, which can support some of the very specific things we're going to be speaking about this afternoon. And with that, Yvette, I'm going to pass it over to you just to share with the group a little bit about our research and the current landscape that everyone is working within.
Great. Thank you, Robbie. So what I want to do is really cover our first objective, and that's really understanding our current landscape. And to do that, next slide, we thought we'd start off with an audience poll. We know when we have a lot of data, but we also want to hear from our audience where everybody is in this space. So if you don't mind clicking on that QR code, and while you do so, we have two questions there. One, does your school or district have a formal AI policy right now? And two, what's your biggest AI policy challenge or question right now? And as you're answering those questions, I just want to be clear that we are not looking to use this data for any other purpose besides the discussion that we'll have later on today. So we'll use your responses for the discussion later on in this portion of the session. We also want to make sure that no one is adding their personal information, whether it's school district name. So please keep this as general as possible, but for us to be able to have a fruitful conversation afterwards. And while people are still putting that on, when we address the current landscape, I want to just share that we are using a lot of our independent research that we've done over the past 2 years to better understand AI in our space. So we've conducted 6 research reports throughout the last 2 years. And within those research reports, we've had key insights from teens, parents, educators, and really being able to use this data to figure out best paths forward to support our educators, our family, and our school leaders. So I'm about to review several pieces of data, but also want to encourage you all to reach out on our site to be able to access this data, because what I'm sharing right now is just a small portion of this research. There's a lot more that we can dive deeper in in each of our reports. Next slide. So really thinking about our data, I want to be able to kind of paint the picture of what we see right now. And I think the thing that is really like shining bright in headlights is the fact that 70% of teens are using AI right now. So if we just take a moment to think about that, we have 70% of teens using AI, yet there have been very little discussions around guidance around use of AI. So you can envision that we have our teens going around working and functioning every day using this with very few opportunities to understand ways to use it responsibly, ethically, and for healthy reasons. Next slide. And I feel like what was happening in the start of this era is a lot of conversations around how it's been used for school purposes, whether it's using it for schoolwork or plagiarism. But the reality is based on our data, we have seen that teens are not only using it for homework, but they're using it in their everyday life, especially to stave off boredom. So we see here, there's been really 2 purposes of using AI amongst teens. That's one on the educational purpose, which is 53% of teens have been using it for schoolwork or translating it to another language, brainstorming ideas, writing a document. And similarly, they've also been using it for their personal use, which is like keeping up, ensuring they're keeping their creative side up, advice, personal issues, and just being able to use this time aside from being bored. And so when we think about this, we think this is really teens' digital life now. And so it's really crucial to be able to provide our young people with the opportunity to understand how they're using it, what they're using it for, and provide that guidance. It's not just homework, but it's their everyday digital life. Next slide. So we're just talking about teens, and I want to take a moment just to give this slide some time on the screen. We're talking about teens, but we've recently conducted a survey surveying parents between the ages of 0 to 8. And what we found is that this is not just a teen situation, that 39% of kids ages 5 through 8 are also using AI for learning. And when we broke it down, you will see on this slide, they're using it for school-related materials, building critical thinking skills, using it for creative purposes, talking or texting with a chat, and also learning it for AI. So we often think about AI, generative AI as a teen or a middle school or high school situation, but we now are starting to realize that there's a need to address it in the elementary levels. So as we get into these objectives of our session, we want to keep in mind that this is not just a middle school or high school need, but this is also an elementary school need. So as we're developing policies in schools and districts, we want to keep this in mind. Next slide. So we have just kind of painted the picture of how teens and students are using it. And what we want to unpack here is what the responses have been from teens around what their teachers are saying. So when teachers talk about this, we're seeing that 60% of teens have reported that their schools have no rules about AI. On top of that, you can see from this graph to the right, about 7% have are telling us that teachers are allowing them to use generative AI. So although we see 70% of kids using AI in their everyday lives, when it comes to what's happening in their schools and in their classrooms, we're seeing very little direction and very little conversation happening in this school space. And so what I'm just wanting to highlight is the huge disconnect between a kid's digital life and what they're doing every day to what's really happening in the school space. So there's a real huge opportunity here to address this gap. Next slide. So we talked about teen use. We've talked about kids using it at a younger age, very little conversations happening in the classroom, and also very little conversations happening between the schools and the parents. So here you'll see 83% of parents say schools have not communicated with families about AI. And so you not only have schools not addressing it at this moment, you also have that there's very little communication between schools and parents. And to go to the next slide, if we dive a little deeper, most parents are even in the dark about how their child uses AI. So this graph here just shows, as we think about all of those teens who have indicated that they use AI, only 37% of their parents are aware that they're using an AI platform. So there's such a small percentage of parents that even are aware that their kids are using it every single day. So we're now seeing a further gap between teens using it to not having this conversation in schools, to not having communication with families, and families are also unaware of this. And so the good news here, though, is that we are starting to see a move. And this slide really shows kind of a progression of us being able to provide professional development training for teachers. So this has happened so quickly to all of us. You know, like I said, 2023, when we put out our first report, we were talking about plagiarism and like, what does AI look like in spaces? And we've moved in this really rapid time to being able to provide professional development to teachers. And so what you see here is a survey by EdWeek. And this survey actually breaks down between March 2024 of last year to October 2024 of last year. And so in March, you'll find that 71% of educators were not receiving any training. Now we kind of have seen that dip in October to 58%. And so you can see across these bar graphs that over time, more and more educators are starting to receive professional development training. But still, I want to emphasize how we need to do more of this, given the amount of students already using it who have not been provided guidance. So we need to make sure that we're addressing the need to upskill and to provide information to educators and the adults who are working with our students, so then that we can actually be able to support our students as they navigate through the generative AI platforms and tools that they're using. Next slide. This slide really helps us understand that although educators are starting to receive this training, we're not seeing it actually trickle down to our students. And so we have seen the training being able to increase over time, but what we haven't seen is actually implementation in the school space, whether that's discussions that happen, whether that's tools being used, or whether that's people being able to say, hey, I'm going to use this in order to, cover these concepts with our students. So this is another disconnect that we want to make sure we address. And I know later on in this session, Robbie will be able to share some tools that we can be able to bring this and be more rapid in the way we're approaching this work. Next slide. So I ran through those slides really quickly. And again, I encourage everyone to look through those reports because there's a really valuable information. And although we started really researching in 2023 and we continue to research, we see these data points that I just shared moving quite rapidly in this space. And so we're seeing movement and we want to continue, and we're encouraging everyone to continue to learn about AI, to understand AI literacy, and understand how we can bring it to our students because they're using it every day, they're engaging with it, and we need to make sure we meet them where they are. And so some three big key takeaways. One, we know kids are using it, and we want to make sure that this is happening now and that we're providing them the guidance to do this responsibly and ethically. Two, teachers and parents are behind, and we want to make sure we're all working together as a collective stakeholders who are supporting our kids in this educational space to provide guidance, tools, policies, recommendations, so that our kids are comfortable and we know that they're using this for healthy reasons. And three, there's a communication gap between schools, teachers, parents, and students. And I know that within our space right now, everybody's learning, everybody's trying to catch up, and our kids are on the fast track of using and implementing it and the way they are, and we want to make sure that we're addressing this in the way. So I want to pass this on to our colleague Paul, who has some really good insight on how we could be addressing AI policies in this space.
Thanks, Yvette. Appreciate the handoff. Well, as you can imagine, the laws on the books these days have not been designed with the idea that AI would be approaching anywhere near the proliferation that it has right now within public and private agencies, and especially in the schools. So I will talk about some laws that circumscribe, I think, and that influence and impact policy development in a second. But the first question is, do you need an AI policy, lawyers? And I'll tell you practically why and legally why. So the answer is yes. Can you copy someone else's policy? Probably not a good idea. I never like to say no, but you can. It's not, sometimes it's a good starting point, but realistically, you're going to need your own policy that is tailored to your specific mission, vision, the types of AI tools you're going to use, and the things that you find is acceptable and unacceptable use. And that's going to vary, and we've already seen it vary dramatically by the individual schools. So next slide, please. So what I want to do is go over the next couple of slides, talk about a number of laws that circumscribe information held by public and private schools, mainly focused on student record information, but could also impact and has impacted, as we'll talk about the data breach, staff personally identifiable information or private information. Here, with federal law and state law, they're focused primarily on what they deem the term personally identifiable information that is, if received by some other party, would allow that party to identify who it is, obviously the name of students, grades, attendance, student records, social security number, date of birth, parents' names, address. All those things are what they call PII, or personally identifiable information. The first law we'll talk about, and most of these laws are directly applicable to public schools and may be applicable to private schools, depending on whether or not they receive any federal funds or federal assistance. But FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, primarily says you must maintain the confidentiality and privacy of personally identifiable information, or PII, and you need parental consent before you release that information. And you can imagine where this intersects with the applications, the software, and the online platforms, the teaching and learning tools that teachers are using in their classroom, is that personally identifiable information can be released to third-party vendors. And it can be allowed because there are exceptions to that parental consent that I just mentioned a minute ago that's requisite to releasing PII for agencies and educational institutions that have an interest or a need to know to be able to serve the student. But it's incumbent upon the school to make sure that their contracts with those vendors specifically note that they are responsible for. They have to maintain, as an agent of the school, that confidentiality of that record information. Next slide, please. So this is just another one of those laws that applies here, the Protection for Pupil Rights Amendment, that speaks to and limits the ability of third-party vendors, software, et cetera, and the schools themselves to be able to test, question, survey, and gather data and information about students. There's another law on the book, by the way, that would also, even when that information is gathered with parental consent, would limit the reuse of that data for marketing, targeting, social media, and things like that. Next slide, please. COPPA, or the Children's Online Privacy Act, focus mainly on those students under the age of 13, is going to affect those K-8 schools and organizations. It affects the operators of websites and online platforms that you're using, again, requiring certain disclosures, what information is being collected, how it's being collected, what it's going to be used for, parental consents, et cetera. Again, these are not laws that prohibit the use of those types of things in the use of educational platform, but there are things that need to be clearly delineated in law through contracts with vendors, who's responsible for what and how it's going to operate. Next slide, please. So before I jump in, just before I talk about two other state laws, well, you're all familiar with the IDEA, federal law, primarily focused, obviously, on serving students with special needs. But as a key component of that is the obligation to maintain the confidentiality of student records, especially those records that you use, IEPs, et cetera, assessments for serving students that fall under the provisions of this law, Section 504, et cetera, which I'll talk about. These provisions also, though, apply to private schools that are receiving those records as part of CUME files. Next slide, please. As I said a moment ago, another federal law with similar provisions that talk about confidentiality of records, but also speaks to, as did the IDEA, access issues for students with disabilities. So the programs, the software, the tools, the hardware you use to implement the educational program have to be accessible as well for students with disabilities. Next slide. So, and before I jump into these cases, to prove that this is not just a lawyer with scare tactics, that it is not just theoretical, there's also constitutional provisions that apply. The constitutional right of privacy in the state of California, for example, that would apply to public and private schools. And that would also apply here to student record information, PII, but maybe even staff record information as well. So just three examples, and believe me, there are plenty of cases right now and lawyers that are working on active cases. And part of my goal with working with clients, and hopefully you'll take away from this session, is by getting ahead of this, by getting a policy, by clearly defining acceptable, unacceptable use and disciplinary issues, et cetera, then you won't be one of these test cases for some of these cases like this. First one, Harris Next Friend versus Adams. This was a case where two students clearly used AI for cheating on a USAP exam. Teachers caught them, student caught them. Parents sued, however, trying to prevent the disciplinary aspect of the students, claiming that their honesty policy and their use of AI was not clearly delineated. Now, the court actually found in their favor, for the school's favor on this, but again, because it was clear the student knew the actions were permitted, the school had previously defined what is unacceptable cheating and plagiarism, and most importantly, the teachers had done a PowerPoint presentation on the use of AI in the classroom and what was prohibited. So again, it was that knowledge to the students that allowed the school here to be able to defend this action. The next one, and the next two actually are somewhat related. The HK versus Google has to do with the software platform on Google Chromebooks and the gathering of data, and whether or not, again, pursuant to some of the laws I just mentioned, the parents had given consent to the gathering of that data. And in those cases, at least in that first case, the plaintiffs had sufficiently alleged that biometric data, for example, was being collected about the students, then the parent consent had not been received in advance. The second, with the Respondus, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a platform that allows online testing without proctors, so they monitor the students' progress and work. And again, another lawsuit there by parents claiming that biometric data was being collected without parental consent. And the court found that in that case, the respondents, the vendor there, didn't have clear policies that met that letter of the law. The problem with these cases is, even if the vendor ends up responsible, if the vendor has a contract with the school and there's an indemnity clause or a risk shifting clause, the school itself can find themselves tied up in these lawsuits as well. So the first one definitely is related just to school use. And as you'll see as we talk about some of the common themes, it's especially in the private schools and in public schools for due process reasons, if you don't clearly delineate what the students can and cannot do, what teachers can and cannot do with AI technologies, you're going to be in for a fight over disciplinary aspects of students and staff. Next slide, please. And to emphasize too the privacy concerns we've talked about and the maintenance of privacy, and again, it's not theoretical. When you share data with outside corporations, even very large companies like PowerSchool, one of the largest student information systems in the country, and certainly in California, We had a massive, massive data breach, most of you are fully aware of, back in December, where all of the student record information, from what I understand, was taken. And so while allegedly they negotiated with a neutral, with the hacker, to get the information destroyed, we don't know. And of course, that triggered a lot of work by the individual schools, et cetera, for having to respond to parent concerns about that information, as well as staff concerns. So when you're developing these agreements, there has to also be a focus on the laws and the best business practices relating to data collection, data storage on their end, the vendor's end, security reasons wise, data usage, what it can be used for and can't be used for, and data retention when the contract is over and how it will be removed or destroyed. Next slide, please. Consistent with the things you heard earlier from the vet, it's not surprising to find here that 88% of the schools do not have an AI policy in place at this time. That's consistent with my experience right now. It's really just happens so fast, and schools, are very slow to evolve in this concept. But again, these policies are going to help prevent liabilities, risks, and dispute. So something definitely to get on. Next slide, please. There's been a number of organizations, including Common Sense, are sponsored today, who have put together principles, guiding principles. And I know Robbie's going to come on later and talk a little bit about those, so I won't go through these in great detail. But the common theme among these typically is not only legal compliance, but safety, privacy, transparency, and ethical, as well as catching biases that can be accountable in these systems. Next slide, please. Some of the policies that we've worked on for clients have this kind of structure to them, where they start to go through an inventory, do their assessment of what AI platforms and tools that the teachers are going to use and students are going to be allowed to use, and put them in sort of this yellow to orange category of encouraged, acceptable use, allowed but maybe circumscribed use, limited use, and then those no use types of policy, those types of procedures and tools that you don't want the students to be having access to. All right, some of the legal issues. So when you're developing your own policies, or you're looking at a sample or a template from somebody to start off with, again, some of the legal issues that I just want to note that we would be focused on, for example, if asked to look at it, would be privacy rights and concerns that I just mentioned, state and federal law, FERPA, COPPA, et cetera. Data collection issues, where's the data, what data is being shared, where's it going, how's it being stored, retained, and used. Access issues associated with the equity and access under state and federal law. And then the key concepts, as I mentioned earlier, as it relates to if you're going to discipline students for academic dishonesty, use of AI, deep fakes, anything like that, there need to be clear boundaries. This is, tied into due process, notice, opportunity to respond. Notice means clearly defined lines of what is acceptable, what is unacceptable. Same for disciplining staff. It doesn't happen as often, but we've had staff that have misused AI already to, phone in lesson plans, or they produce something that is not consistent with the curriculum outlined in this for the school. Again, notice, fairness, clear boundaries. Vendor contracts, we talked about a moment ago with the privacy, data sharing, risk sharing, warranty clauses, indemnity, insurance, security, et cetera. And obviously, knowledge of compliance with the federal laws relates to, state and federal laws relates to data privacy. There are copyright issues in some cases coming up. There's a lot of fair use exceptions for schools, but there are copyright issues with what's being input into and brought into the different AI platforms and being reconstructed or merged and things like that, music, art, and copyrighted curriculum materials, or it can be issues. And then I would just say that the state and federal law is fast changing. We have a program in the state of California, or a committee, I should say, in the state of California that's already developing some guidelines that should be out here by 2026. We have new laws as it relates to adding AI and computer science curriculums, adding AI literacy to ELA curriculums, and there are laws trying to be passed right now that are going to continue to influence this. So staying ahead of the state and federal legal compliance issues. And then bias, as I'm sure you've heard, anything that's built off of human systems already, and or human information could include implicit bias. And so there has to be some recognition and knowledge of that going into these systems. Little practical guidance, and I know Robbie's going to get into this a little more detail, so I won't drill down too much on this, but it's always helpful before you start developing your policies, if you conduct an assessment of your, what AI tools are you using? And it's helpful to do that on a regular basis and see what students and staff members are using. Engage in professional development. It's going to be the training parts that Yvette was talking about earlier, educating your leadership, your board, your staff, and your students on the use of AI. Again, what's allowed, what's not allowed, et cetera. Maintaining a school-wide list of approved and not approved AI software, and that new software has to be approved or go through a vetting process. Conducting student education on acceptable use and parent education, notification and education as well. And then developing and maintain academic integrity and plagiarism policies for student and staff. What tools will you allow your staff and your leadership to use to determine whether or not students are using AI to cheat in the writing or research or the production of information. So just some further general principles around developing policies. Make sure your policies align with your school mission, vision, and that's why they'll all differ from school to school and differ by the types of tools that'll be allowed and people's sensitivity and interest in using AI tools. Clearly defined boundaries, training, transparency and use, so parents are aware, educated about this. Legal review of contracts and usage and licensing agreements. You can consider allowing an opt-out for parents. You could allow, I have one client who, for example, has a student AI contract with their students to just drive home the importance of what's acceptable, not acceptable. And then monitoring evaluation of use, changing platforms, changing, the platforms themselves are changing and evolving so quickly, and whether teachers are using them or students are using them in different ways than originally anticipated. And then monitoring legislative changes and court rulings, which there will be more of, as I talked about earlier. Red flags. So some of the takeaways. I highly recommend you don't copy somebody else's policy without customization. Don't create policies that are too vague or too high level to be enforced. That's not going to serve you well or be effective at all. Don't ignore state and federal legal requirements in putting your policies together. Implement, don't implement without staff student training, communication, feedback, et cetera. Don't wait for the perfect policy. There isn't going to be one. There's, as you see them, they're all over the map. But as we'll say here in closing remarks, key takeaways is a policy is going to be better than no policy. And it'll be a policy that will be iterative and change over time. So there's no perfect policy. Don't sign contracts and license agreements for software, robotics, hardware, et cetera, without legal review, because there is a lot of risk shifting going on by these companies back to the organizations that are engaging them. And then don't ignore the data privacy security risks that are very real out there, as we've demonstrated. I'll leave you this slide. I won't go down through all the bullet points, but this is sort of a short-term, long-term, what I would recommend you get done now, the AI assessment, develop some clear acceptable use guidelines, et cetera. And then more on the 3 to 6 month and ongoing would be, the policy, further policy development, professional development, annual professional development, education programs, monitoring, and regular update. As I said, key takeaways: better to have a good policy, a compliant policy right now than just risk legal dispute at a later point. And then again, educate staff, students, and parents. It's a great time to do it right now, especially in the early part of the school year when you start back in August, to be able to get ahead of these things. Turn it back over to you, Robbie.
Paul, thanks so much for that. Just really appreciate the clarity from you around some of those key messages of making sure you have a policy, making sure you are engaging your stakeholders, that you're training those stakeholders, that you're setting those clear boundaries, and that you're communicating with them. And I think to that end, one of the things that we at Common Sense Media have to share as a takeaway resource for you today is an AI tool kit for school districts. Here's a QR code to access that. If you're on a mobile device, we'll also place a link to this so that you can click on it out of the session. Our intention in creating this was not to, just create another toolkit for the sake of creating another toolkit. We know that there are a range of other toolkits that are out there, local guidance, state guidance, federal guidance in some cases. But to the stat that 88% of schools don't currently have a policy, and don't currently 80% of parents don't currently feel like their schools have communicated with them about AI, and students are getting unclear messages from schools around AI usage. We did create this resource to support districts at any stage of implementation in thinking about how that implementation is going, and to provide some concrete resources to support next steps. I'm only going to talk at a very high level about the toolkit. We encourage you to explore it, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of resources that can help you. If you were listening to Paul or Yvette, you were like, that's great. How do I actually do that? Or that's great. Like, what are my next steps? We have some guides and tools to help you with that. This toolkit is built around an AI readiness assessment that you can conduct to understand your current readiness level across a number of domains. It then suggests a series of implementation steps. So if developing an AI policy is part of your implementation steps, there are some tools to support with that. If you are at the mission, vision, values level where you're still trying to clarify, well, why would we use AI, or what's our orientation to that within our district's goals, you would start there. If you're further along, we have some tools to support with monitoring implementation, or conducting some of the parent trainings or staff trainings that Paul was describing just a moment ago. We do suggest this tool to be used with a broad team of stakeholders. This shouldn't be something that a superintendent or a chief information officer or someone in a central office is doing by themselves. We do suggest use of this as a self-assessment tool to begin or revisit AI implementation planning. This can also be used to surface gaps and guide internal conversations around AI readiness. And we also suggest the use of this tool as a potential benchmarking tool, so that you can review your progress over time or across departments as you're considering how your implementation plans are going. Relevant to our conversation today, the implementation, the readiness assessment and implementation guide that we just looked at helps walk through a series of reflection prompts that are on the screen here. Things like, do you have AI use policy? Have you created those clear guidelines for different stakeholders that Paul was just speaking to? Do you have a mechanism by which you've actively reviewed compliance with these important federal and state and other privacy laws? Do you have a monitoring system related to AI usage? Do you have that review process that Paul spoke about in terms of being able to approve and purchase and monitor the use of those tools? And do you have a clear set of responsibilities to support with oversight and enforcement of AI within your school district or school? Some of the resources that are linked off of that section of the readiness assessment are things like this tool, the AI responsible use policy template. So this is a policy template that walks you through the creation of that AI use policy. It has suggested uses, it has prompts, it has some example language or things to consider. So if you're at a school or a district that doesn't yet have a policy, this is a great place to start. We also have a compliance checklist to help you think about how you are complying with the range of regulations that Paul described in his section of the presentation. So if you hear nothing else from these resources at this time, just know that we have some scaffolds, some concrete and very practical and easy to use tools to hopefully support you with some of the types of activities that we've described over the course of the webinar so far. Also included in the AI toolkit are a series of case studies of districts that are at different stages of AI implementation. I did just want to provide an example of one. This is Agua Fria High School District located in Arizona. They operate a series of 6 high schools. And I think a couple of things that I would highlight from this case study that are relevant to our conversation today is just they have a values-driven implementation approach that's aligned to their district mission. They've done comprehensive stakeholder engagement across all of their schools. They have some clear guidance with practical examples on how to use AI in classrooms, which I'll show you in a second. And they've engaged in ongoing professional learning related to AI. But all of this is rooted in the policy work and the vision work that they did to get this off the ground. So Just a few things I would elevate from their practice. First, in the center here, they did a lot of work to backwards map their AI usage from their portrait of a graduate or graduate profile, which is in the center of the screen here. They then developed a responsible use policy, and one of the aspects of that responsible use policy is a practice that within their district they call CARE, which is a practice that students and staff use to iteratively identify potential issues or challenges related to AI outputs. They've also, in terms of some of that student clarity that Paul was speaking to, they have a system called the AI stoplight that you can see in every single one of their classrooms, where on slides or within their LMS, it's clearly indicated to students whether this is a assignment for which they can't use AI, whether it's one where they can use AI with some parameters around its use, or whether it's an assignment in which the student may use AI freely. And I think that type of clarity has been very helpful for students. We've spoken to the staff at Agua Fria. Do they still have to engage in conversations with students about academic honesty? Absolutely. We had to engage with students about academic honesty conversations before AI, but I think some of this clarity has been very helpful for them in navigating the moment that we're in right now. We are going to open it up to Q&A in a moment, sort of related to addressing your biggest challenges and questions. Thank you so much to everyone who has been putting those questions into our form. If you have further questions that have come up over our conversation this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me, please feel free to go ahead and drop those in as well. We'll continue collecting those. I do just want to switch over here and just share with you a couple of quick insights from our opening poll before we move into bring all of our panelists on stage and engage in Q&A. I think one of the things you'll see here is that this group may actually look very similar to the data that Paul shared earlier. Only about 10% of the folks in the room today have a formal AI policy adopted. And the rest, about 90% of the folks in the room, reported either that they don't have a formal AI policy adopted at their school or district, or that they're not sure. So we hope that the guidance that we've shared today is resonant and helpful in helping you think about how you can become one of the schools or districts that does have an AI policy, given some of the need for that Paul described a moment ago. With that, let's go ahead and bring our panelists back on stage all together, and we'll go ahead and engage in a conversation rooted in some of the things that have come up from our audience. So Yvette, I think I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Robbie. So we thank you so much for all of you who have been able to fill out the questions. We have some really great questions, and I want to actually start off because I think, Robbie, you brought up the Aguas Frias example, and I think you have some case studies of more. But there's a question here from one of our participants around how do you create AI policies that protect academic integrity without limiting beneficial uses? And so you brought up Aguas Frias as one, and I think you gave us some examples, but do you have any other insight around how you do protect academic integrity without limiting beneficial uses?
Yeah, I don't want to pretend that this isn't a complex question, and I think it's also rooted in, of course, the educational vision that any institution has. I mean, I think, look, for me, this starts off just with a question about what's the purpose of education? What do we want students to be getting out of their learning experiences? And is this a place where AI can be helpful or not? I think that academic integrity for the sake of academic integrity maybe isn't the name of the game here. Students do need to be able to use AI safely, ethically, responsibly, and effectively for preparation for college and careers. We absolutely know that, especially as students move up to the high school age. So banning it doesn't work. It's not effective. Our polling data, Yvette, that you shared showed that kids are using AI even when they're told not to. And I think that sort of begs the question of, well, how do we then create the conditions where we can teach students to use the tools? I think the one thing I will say is that we do know that there's certain types of critical thinking skills that you have to practice. I sometimes use the sports analogy. You have to get your reps in to be able to develop some of those critical thinking skills. And I think it's important to be straight up with students and to say, hey, there's times where you are going to have to do the work yourself to get those reps in. And once you've learned some of those skills, maybe that's a better opportunity for you to use AI because you understand some of those habits of mind.
Thanks, Robbie. We also have a question from one of our participants. This question feels like a question directed to Paul around implementation and enforcement. So Paul, one of the questions is, given that many students use AI regardless of bans, how should schools shift from policing AI use to educating about appropriate versus inappropriate use? And I'm going to extend this a bit to say, what's the difference between AI use and AI abuse in education context?
And I think this sort of gets right back to the question we were talking about a minute ago, right? Is where you draw the line, how you draw the line. And clients have approached this differently. Some are absolutely will not allow any AI use, for example, in writing of assignments. And some want to encourage people to be able to use AI platforms in order to be able to write for various assignments, but attribute the work that's being done, or maybe refined through Grammarly, or maybe it's Claude or something like that, through that process. So I think there's a fine line. The clarity, though, has to come, I think, with the clarity has to come with the types of software that are allowed or not used. Some of our clients provide the hardware, some of the hardware, for example, laptops, et cetera. So they are actually able to more accurately track what the students are using, at least on that laptop. It's not going to prevent the student from sitting at two computers at home and doing something that's not allowed on one computer to be able to help them on the other computer. There's a lot of software out there now being developed to help schools and educators reverse engineer whether something AI has been used. There's a lot of data that's being collected by schools about timeliness of return of homework, timeliness on exams, length of responses, speed of response, all that sort of thing, to be able to determine. Some want to get very granular with that and get very much into that and empower the teachers to determine what is where it crosses the line. Others want to keep that line a little more vague, to allow students a little more freedom. I'm personally a little biased in the sense that I believe this is here. It's here to stay. It's going to be implemented. There's going to be a whole new critical thinking about prompt origination, and there's new thinking that has to occur through the use of new technology. And so you definitely don't want to, as getting back to the question, you don't want to define a policy in such a way that prevents students from being able to benefit by that learning that has to occur in order to be able to advance through high school, college, and into the work career, to their careers in the field. So.
And Paul, just to add on to that briefly, just from our perspective at Common Sense Media, I saw a question roll in about, can we just use AI detectors to help ban AI? I think part of what I heard in your response is there's lots of ways that you can work around AI detectors as they currently exist that students are using. You can have multiple computers. You can have an overlay installed on a computer. I know you talked about some of the other signals that schools might be able to take advantage of to determine whether a student is using AI to complete an assignment. I think from our research and our risk assessments program, in the lightweight look that we've taken at AI detectors, I think we would just caution the educators in the audience to say that the evidence that these work is very shaky. There's a lot of potential challenges related to their application. I think, this conversation is making me think about some of those legal risks that you incur if you falsely accuse a student of using AI when they in fact haven't, on the basis of an AI detector. So I think some of those things make me think about the need for policies about like how you are going to monitor whether an assignment was completed with AI assistance or not. Things like as part of like that connection to sort of your academic integrity policy and your student discipline policy.
No, absolutely. There are experts now that are developing themselves as consultants and experts to schools to be able to help them look at that AI detection software. There's software to counter that software. Humanize AI. The students are using to try to get around things that look like AI. So it's kind of a cat and mouse game. But I agree with you. And a lot of those softwares, if you looked at them, they're only going to give you a statistical range. It's like, 65% chance this was written by AI. Well, I don't want to go into court and try to defend the disenrollment of a child based upon software that like you said, can be challenged first. And then secondly, is only 65% saying that this is potentially AI.
Yeah.
It just gives, I think it gives teachers and educators an opportunity to go back and raise the question with the students. The teachers I've talked to said, look, I know, for example, like looking back at myself, I know Paul when he entered ninth grade, and I know what he's doing now in 10th grade. Doesn't look like what he's doing in ninth grade, and I know he didn't improve that much. There's a little bit of human impact in this analysis as well.
And Paul, you mentioned this this information going beyond K-12, and I know that a lot of higher education institutions have started thinking through this and encouraging usage or partnering to use it. Have we learned anything from the higher education space? That was a question from one of the participants. Like, how does K-12 policies differ or align with what's happening in the higher education spaces?
Personally, I've only looked at a few of the higher ed policies, and I would say that there's as many, I've probably looked at 6. So for example, it's a very limited set, and there's as many different policies at the higher ed, public, private differ, size of the school differ, that sort of thing, than as I've seen already in the K-12 space. So I'm not sure I see any alignment or misalignment, but I see thoughtful, reflective, analysis occurring and differentiation.
And on that note, I think one of the key differences, of course, between K-12 and higher ed is that in K-12 you have many more potential users who are under 18, and they require additional supports and thinking based on the legal framework, Paul, that you fleshed out for us today. So I think that's just to say that in the under 18 space, in the K-12 space, and at least from the perspective of our toolkit, as we're having some of the resources in place to help schools who may be earlier along, we really encourage people to start thinking about staff usage of AI tools. Of course, you have to provide clarity to students. We've been talking a lot about academic honesty, but staff usage is definitely a lower risk place to start because it involves adults and not minors.
Yeah. Certainly the data collection sensitivity issues for the under 18 versus over 18, completely different sets of rules and laws that apply to the higher ed space as well.
Yeah. And Robbie, you touched on the usage for teachers. And I think there's a question here around professional development. And it's like, how do you address the stigma around AI use amongst educators and help teachers become more comfortable with AI rather than against it? So like, what needs to be done to really address that stigma?
I think from my perspective, this is actually less about stigma and more about teachers maybe not having seen the use case yet that really resonates with them, where they're like, okay, that's how I would use that in my practice, or it makes sense to me why I would use this tool. I think we've been talking about mission, vision, and values, and why you need to align the work to your mission and vision and values. But the real part of that is just making sure that educators understand that this is a tool that's part of their toolbox. We're not talking about AI use for AI use's sake. We're talking about AI use because it could help with instruction, or it could support with data analysis, or it could support with a variety of other things that educators are doing as part of their core jobs, in the same way that the internet helps with those things. Nobody says we're going to have a professional development today on lesson planning and the internet. We say we're having a professional development on lesson planning, and the internet happens to be part of it. It's a tool that we use as part of that. So one of the things that strikes me, Yvette, on that Ed Week set of slides that you shared is just there are about 1 in 3 teachers in the US right now who say that not only have they not used AI, but they will never use AI. I think my first thing that I would say to those folks is let's show a little bit of a growth mindset around that. That's something we preach to our students. But the second thing I would say is I get it, right? We've all been through the last EdTech revolution. We've seen some of the promises of technology and education maybe not play out the way that we would have wanted them to. And I think there's an opportunity for this revolution to go differently, but that's only going to go differently if we have all educators involved in shaping it. And if we have a third of teachers opting out, we're not going to get the best set of outcomes for kids and families. Yvette, I think we have time for one more question, perhaps, and then we'll.
I was just going to. One thing I was going to add on to that is I've seen teachers embrace this because it's going to allow them to create differentiated educational plans and programs for the kids in their class at a speed they've never been able to before, if it's used right. And then for the instructional part of it, I've seen things that just absolutely. I want to go back to K-12 space. These virtual programs that allow you to interact with historical figures in real time to be able to experience that. There's just some really exciting things. So I would think part of the elimination of the stigma may be just the education of, the benefits that it can bring while measuring the risks and mitigating against the risks with a policy. Sorry,
And so,
Robbie.
and Paul, I think I want to close on the final question here around just equity and access. We want to ensure that we're serving all students and that we know everywhere is different. You mentioned it, Paul, don't just copy, but what is this? How does this work for your distance? When we think about AI and implementing an AI policy, like what do we need to think about when it comes to equity and access for all? What are some challenges, potential challenges, or potential assets in developing an AI policy?
Being aware of the limitations, like you said, who has access to it, whether it's going to be provided, it's an online platform. Do the parents have access to computers? Do they have access to the internet? Do we have students with disabilities? Do they have learning disabilities? Are they going to be able to utilize the software? Do they have physical disabilities that's going to prevent them from being able to interact that particular software? Being aware of all of that and being able to make sure that the way you're implementing the tool that you want or using the tool is open to all, it's accessible to all, whether it could be, language translation or anything like that. All the equity and access issues that we have. And the companies that I've seen that are working in this space are very aware, especially the ones that are trying to target their software and their products for the K-12 space, very aware that they have to meet that in order to be able to have expansive use.
Great. I'll pass it on to you, Rafi.
Thanks. Well, again, we just want to thank everyone for joining us today. If we could get the slides back on the screen, that would be great. Just want to leave us all with this image, which is just meant to illustrate that AI is a tool, and we've seen other tools in educational settings be adopted and maybe not have the impact that they were intended to have. I think one of the things that I often think of when I look at this image, which is from the early 1900s, is this tool was introduced, in this case, the abacus. And, abacuses are really cool and can be used for a bunch of interesting mathematical thinking. But if you look at sort of the container that the abacuses are in, this is recognizably similar to the way that many classrooms here in the US and indeed across the world still look. Kids in rows, single teacher, direct instruction. And I just put this up here to encourage us all to think about, again, what's the system within which we are delivering education? How does AI have the opportunity to shift that system to be more learner-driven, to be more joyful, to be more focused on careers, to be more whatever the unique work that you are trying to do in your school or district is aimed to do? Is there an opportunity for the technology to support with that? So we're not just doing tech for tech's sake. With that, just want to close off with a quick call to action. We have our district toolkit linked here on the screen. We know from our presentation today that students are already using AI. We need to help them learn how to use it responsibly. We don't want to wait per Paul's guidance to develop an AI policy. We need to provide clarity to students, staff, and families. And we have a set of resources here that can help no matter where you are in the process. With that, thanks again so much from our team at Common Sense Media. We are here to support you in this work. Please check out our resources and reach out if there's other things that we could be helpful with. Paul, thank you so much. Yvette, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and expertise today.
Thank you both.